G'day folks, my name is Brendon Ray. I'm representing Australia as a delegate for IYMS this year, and this talk today is about the rise of the far right, particularly in the last several years. I want to start off by saying that the internet is a violent collective unconscious of every single frustration, morbid curiosity, and taboo that we ever could have thought. It serves many great purposes as it allows us to find data for information, to inform our world, and we can connect to other people and groups both on a local and an international level. This has a lot of blessings in many ways, and I think that it can uphold many of the ethical fundamentals that's integral to IYMS's spirit, that we are all on the same boat and all one people under a big blue sky, and we're capable of creating prosperity through our connectiveness to one another. But what happens when, instead of learning about the world as is, you look for content to validate the reality that you choose? What happens when, instead of connecting to different people of different origins, you stick with the people who are most similar to you and tell you exactly what you want to hear? Especially when something's bothering you and you're looking for the same boogeyman. Aldous Huxley once said in an interview that all technology is in itself morally neutral, but they are immensely powerful as instruments of control. In order for a new dictator to come into power and sustain itself indefinitely, it must be done with the consent of the ruled. Through appealing to man's subconscious and emotions, one can love his own authoritarian state. This video is about the rise of right-wing populism, far-right politics, and the alt-right, particularly on the internet. This will summarize its danger, its influence, its tactics, and what can be done to resist these efforts. So let's start with the first question. Who is the far right? And this is a tricky question to answer because how long is a piece of string? The point where someone goes from a moderate conservative to the point where they're an authoritarian or even a fascist is very blurry, and sometimes people can support some hard-right policies and refute others. You can settle with identifying people by who identifies themselves as hard-right compared to moderate conservatives, but that's kind of a flawed strategy as well. Many folks proclaim themselves as moderate conservatives, and they'll still end up supporting politicians and proposals for laws that are nationalist and targeting of minorities and women's rights, that can be anti-regulation, and policies that can be environmentally damaging. At that point, voters and content creators of that kind are a distinction without a difference. Generally, this is a good rule of thumb to identify whether a person or a personality is far right. One is that they're nationalists. They believe in identifying with the general nation as an important aspect to one's character. They have an obsession with the idea of an imaginary better time, when authorities were respected or when society was in some elevated state than it was today. They tend to preach slogans about being realistic and down to earth, despite being cynical of experts and attracted to policies that are emotionally validating to them. They tend to place an importance on manhood and masculinity, typically in a very comic book Conan the Barbarian kind of masculinity. Often, this is opposed to anything that's considered feminine. They also have a great concern for the left, and hypothesize that they're responsible for the crumbling of society. Gender and identity politics, unions, antitrust regulations are the usual scapegoats for the ills of society. More conspiratorial thinkers will go so far as to say that there's a leftist cabal that is secretly running the earth. Folks of the hard right have a doublethink relationship when it comes to the concept of freedom. They have great concern of a totalitarian left state that silences free speech, but simultaneously have great admiration for authoritarian leaders like Putin or Duterte. People not very well known for placing great value in freedom of speech for their opponents. Under far-right doublethink, you can have freedom, but a specific kind of freedom that correlates to the state. There's this general positive attitude towards the concept of free speech. This is less of a principle and more of a slogan. Far-righters place value in speech that is politically correct and critical of identity politics and even minorities themselves. It's worth noting that this does not apply to people who expose governments or challenge misdoings of society. Right voters have burned their Nikes because of Colin Kaepernick, and I don't remember anybody vouching for the freedom of Chelsea Manning for her whistleblowing. For even harder right folks, there's a great emphasis placed on the need for homogeny, implying that different ethnic groups cannot live with one another. White fascists also have fears of being replaced, and being outpopulated, which they incorrectly identify as genocide. Their advertised solutions to these concerns would be forced relocations of different people, but we all know that if given the power, far more insidious solutions would come up. While there are many other identifiers and traits, we would be here for a lot longer time than we have. Please do the research yourself and inform yourself as much as you can. So, what tactics do they use? We know the basic details of the far right, but I think what's overlooked is how they specifically bring attention to themselves, what they do to garner support, and how they challenge their opponents. Oftentimes, it's easy enough just to say, this group is popular because it's racist, or it's popular because it's sexist, but we often don't consider how they even breed those xenophobic ideas into normal people. How do they make themselves likable? How do they make ideas that 10 or 20 years ago would have been shocking into something that's quite normal for an opinion to have? So these are the various tactics that they use to get by. One of the biggest ones is creating caricatures of the opposition. The big example of this is the idea of the SJW, known as the social justice warrior or the political cuckold. Social justice warrior often defined as an unlikable person fighting for ideas related to social justice. And cuckold usually is an insult referring to men who like to see their partners be in the company of other men. Unfortunately, while these caricatures can be funny in their try-hard nature, other negative strawmans are much more disturbing, often relying on racial stereotypes and dehumanizing depictions of certain peoples, which I'm not going to show for you today. Also worthy of note, the obsession with cuckoldry as a fetish has its own psychological double-edged sword. According to trends on Google statistics, the one American state where cuckoldry was the most searched term was North Dakota, a famously red state. Sometimes whoever smelt it did dealt it. Not that we should judge them for their interests, of course. Another tactic that the far right employs is the use of humor in hyperbolic statements that fall under the category of Poe's law. For those not in the know, Poe's law is the internet maxim that states that it's impossible to parody extreme views or sentiments without people taking the message sincerely. Playing the freedom of speech card, as mentioned earlier, far-right internet users have a tendency to be very attracted to politically incorrect humor. Politically incorrect humor is fine depending on the context and intent, but can be distressing when such humor is used as cryptic encouragement of authoritarian and xenophobic sentiment. What makes this worse is that there is actual evidence that exposure to this type of humor has the tendency to nullify the ethical weight of the content discussed. An example of this would be the old joke, Hitler did nothing wrong. The joke works insidiously well as both just a shocking joke to get a reaction, but also as a cryptic form of propaganda. It's shocking to most people, so most people are not going to think that the person is serious. However, for those who repeat the joke, the repeated exposure becomes less shocking and more banal, maybe even convincing. And especially if someone is confused to other far-right talking points, they may even believe the statement they once said out of humor to just be a true statement. The joke, Hitler did nothing wrong, is no longer funny to that person because it's shocking. It's funny to that person because they think it's true. This puts opponents to the far right in a bit of a rock and a hard place. allow this kind of humor, allow this kind of behavior on the case of plausible deniability, and the far-right nationalists will spread their ideas without any hiccups. Try to prevent this kind of humor, and the far-right will be vindicated and put forth propaganda saying their freedom of speech is being targeted. There are a lot of other tactics that far-right users use, probably really important ones that we didn't get to, but here's a lightning round of some others that are important to note. Whataboutism. Should you accuse somebody of using any of these tactics, users will often try to deflect them by saying that people on the left still use them also. And while that's true to an extent, the staggering majority of these dirty tactics are used by the far right, and two wrongs don't make a right regardless. Fallacious arguments. Keep this in the front of your mind. The far right isn't here to realize science or the truth. It appeals to authority and will use statistics should it visually imply its worldview, but there is no respect for who is the so-called expert. We saw this in the pandemic. For those of you not in the know, a logical or argumentative fallacy is a statement or argument based on invalid reference or on false notions. When people on the far right argue, their purpose is not to create a solid structure of argument. Sometimes it isn't even to win. They want to spread ideas that are emotionally validating, memorable, and simple. Straw man, ad hominem, slippery slope, middle ground, correlation/causation, no true Scotsman. These are all examples of argumentative fallacies that we usually think are mistakes in logical thinking, but to the far right, the surely structure that these arguments are made is not a mistake. These are meant to be flawed and emotional because they get a reaction. Token minorities. Some far-right organizations will select minorities in their group to serve as figureheads in an attempt to confuse people outside of the movement and also to shield themselves from accusations of xenophobia. Individuals from certain ethnic groups or sexual orientations will sometimes be drawn to hard-right groups for various reasons. They may find authoritarian politics appealing, they may enjoy their novel status in the group, or they may feel loathing towards their own personal communities. However, it's worth noting that they will be the first to abandon should they make a mistake, and they are still able to be subject to internal discrimination. Even moderate conservatives like Blair White consistently face heartbreaking transphobia in debates with other right-wing personalities. Delegitimizing the media. Naturally, the larger media is going to report and correct the far right on its violence, its fallacies, and its true intentions. There is reason to be doubtful of the media. Everybody has their copy of Noam Chomsky, but the far right really is going to take advantage of that doubt. Conspiracy theories, accusations of Orwellianisms, insults, all of these are vocalized so as to mock and undermine any authority that the media may have. Also helps if you have a hard right news organization like OAN and Fox News that will do everything in their power to ignore their far right audience or even support their presence. There are a number of other strategies that are involved. I implore you to research them yourself if you want to know how these groups maintain their relevancy and how they connect to other people. So at this point, you're probably asking yourself, what can I do? What should I do? But I think before we go further, we have to understand why it is imperative that we understand why we are opposed to these groups. I do not want to understate the damage that these organizations, these hate mobs, and these individuals can do. On an individual level, they can carry out murders and hate crimes. In groups, they create militias and cause gang violence and even attempt to overthrow their local governments. On the national level, they create policies that encourage discrimination and remove safety laws and regulations for victims of sexual assault, workplace exploitation, and police brutality. And don't think that there's a limit to this darkness. In 2017 in Russia, legal procedures were made to remove laws that convicted people of spousal abuse, thereby legalizing domestic violence. On the online space, it was heralded as an abandonment of feminism. Russia was going back to its roots. It was finally leaving behind the feminist plague. But In reality, Russia's rate of domestic violence went up by 20 times the amount previous. The rate that was 36,000 cases of domestic violence, which is still a shockingly high amount, went up to 600,000 cases a year. 600,000 women scared and hurt by their own husbands who were able to act with no legal consequence. In a poll where women were asked where they felt the most unsafe, 49% of respondents said home was the answer. This is the far right. This is the utopia the far right actively works toward. An illusion of a white picket fence society tended by the hands of women, slaved by minorities and queer folk, and or to please the angry men of the household. So now you ask, what can I do? And unfortunately, I don't have all of the answers, but we need them. And we also need to do something. We can't expect other good people to do the work for us. These are some of the steps that you can take presently. First of all, research. I've said it multiple times, and I will say it again. Learn more about the far right, the alt-right, the alt-light, whatever they decide to call themselves. Learn more about them. How they're present in your local community, what they want, what they intend to do, what are their strategies, what politicians are neutral or friendly towards them, who they want to vote for, and what other tactics they will use to gain traction. Learn also how people are roped into these groups, whether it's through the internet, or television, or in person. Inform your local government. Call your mayor, your council, person who is leading your state. Tell them that you are concerned about the presence of far-right rhetoric on the internet in your community. Tell them that you want something done about it. Whether it's preventative programs to stop radicalization, or more funding for authorities to locate and prevent such groups from conducting terrorist activities, because they do conduct them. Don't take it sitting down. Getting into comment section fights and picketing does not work, but dismantling the illusion does. Save every moment, every piece of evidence, and every screenshot where the true radical right comes into play. The idiotic campaigns, the statements that are messed up even in context, and especially the acts of violence, which there are many. Have it ready every time the far right wants to preach his self-righteousness, and when it wants to play the high ground in any situation. The far right wants to be the tough and stoic good guy. Do not let them have that narrative, because that is not the story they'll tell in power. Change the societal context. We can argue whether or not the people in this group are evil. We cannot argue, however, that a lot of these people in this group are hurting. Like us, they're stuck in an ever-changing and volatile world of job loss, wealth disparity, lack of healthcare, and open corruption. If people aren't drawn to the far right because of the policies themselves, they are drawn to the sense of community and the assurance that there is an answer for their trouble. It's not always the people that you hate that fall into this line of thinking. It can be your family, it can be your friends, it can be your colleagues, it can be your lover. It can be anybody. I'm not saying that all of these people are good at heart. Many of them are truly insidious. But in order for de-radicalization to work, we have to make an environment where ex-radicals can live in. And a world where that isn't always on the brink of destruction. That means it's on us to make this world a physically better, physically more comfortable place for everyone. Because when people are desperate, they can be conned by terrible people under the illusion of hope. Don't let this be normal. The far right wants to present itself as a norm, as typical as rocks in the ground and sand in the beach. But this is not normal. Not because there hasn't been a history of discrimination and violence before, but because we will not let it be normal. If lives are on the line, then it is not a normality that we are going to accept. Always have that mindset. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you have a good day. I hope you've learned a lot.